Dr. Rajeev Raghavan is an aquatic conservation biologist known for his work on the freshwater fishes of the Western Ghats Biodiversity Hotspot. He is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Fisheries Resource Management, CUFOS, Kochi, India, and the South Asia coordinator of IUCN's Freshwater Fish Specialist Group. He also works in honorary capacity as the head of Science and Knowledge, India, for the Mahasi Trust, an international NGO based in the UK.
A quick thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk to this gathering here. And as the chairman rightly pointed out during his initial talk, the importance of biodiversity is rightly focused here in this aquaculture conference. So normally in an international aquaculture conference, biodiversity conservation tends to get overlooked, although both needs to work in association. So it's definitely heartening to see that the organizers of Braqcon has included such a session in this conference. So the world is going through an exceptional biodiversity crisis, an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. And as a result, the United Nations and the world's policymakers have come up with different policy frameworks to guide conservation and sustainable use towards the next 20 to 30 years. So I'll be talking through two of the most important policy frameworks. One is the Aichi biodiversity targets and the sustainable development goals, and how it relates to estuarine biodiversity conservation to an Indian context. So we are now in an era that the scientific community calls as the Anthropocene, an era that has witnessed human impacts on terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity and resources like never before. So this Anthropocene has impacted aquatic resources more than terrestrial resources. So there is a high human dependence on aquatic biodiversity. They are at a far greater risk than their terrestrial counterparts. Aquatic biodiversity have a high rate of extinction risk. And then the most important point here is that human-induced changes on aquatic biodiversity are mostly irreversible. So that speaks about the importance of Anthropocene on aquatic biodiversity. So we all know that Earth is known as the water world, where 3/4 of the world is covered by water and 90% of this is oceans. So where is estuaries here, and what is the world's coverage of estuaries? So this is one estimate that was published in 2011, which says that the global total estuarine surface area is around 1.1 million kilometers square. And this 1.1 million square kilometers covered by around 1,200 plus major estuaries. And most importantly, this is the point of discharge for 80% of the world's rivers. So this is the most important point that you need to take into consideration. And when you look at the different services provided by estuaries, you can see a whole range of services that is present at the table there, right from food to ecosystem services, recreational services, erosion control, etc. So estuaries provide a wide array of services for biodiversity and mankind. And so conserving estuarine biodiversity and its resources is more of a human approach than a biodiversity approach. Basically, because 60% of the global population live within a few kilometers of estuarine areas. 22 of the 32 large metropolitan cities of the world are built along estuaries. 16 megacities are built along estuaries with more than 10 million people. And 62% of major estuaries occur within 25 kilometers of urban centers, which hold more than 100,000 people. So that speaks itself the importance of why humans are important to estuaries and why we need to sustainably manage estuaries. So if you look at 10 of the large cities of the world, there are predictions that the combined populations of these 10 large cities that are built along estuaries will reach a whopping 216 million by the year 2025. So what are the pressures or stress to estuaries? So they're both short-term and medium to long-term stress. Stress factors like urbanization, overexploitation, aquaculture are all short-term pressures. And you also have a long-term pressures, including climatic disturbances, sea level rise, etc. So all these, both short-term and long-term, have a direct impact on the estuarine environments. So we all know that estuaries are important, but there's been several declines associated with estuaries and coastal ecosystems and their benefits and services. So we have lost 50% of the world's salt marshes, we have lost 50% of the world's mangroves, we have lost 29% of the world's seagrass ecosystems, more than 50% of tidal flats around the world has been lost. And totally, if you look at estuaries in general, there's a 50% or more loss of estuarine habitats in the world. This is over the last 20 years. And if you look at the services provided by estuaries, so there are studies that say that of what is remaining of the non-collapsed fisheries, we have lost 33% of all that viable non-collapsed fisheries that are existing. We've lost 69% of nursery habitats, which are the most critical components of estuaries, which includes oyster reef, seagrass beds, and wetlands. We've lost 63% of ecosystem services provided by estuaries, including filtering and detoxification services. So these are all published in very recent papers, including the Global Wetland Outlook, which was published last year in 2018. So, from rivers to sea, I would say that estuarine ecosystems are largely ignored on the global conservation agenda, simply because, in some reports, you get estuaries included in the freshwater part of the story. In some, you have estuaries included in the marine part of the story. But then there is no specific focus on estuarine ecosystems. There are several very highly cited and interesting reviews on the global state and challenges for both marine and freshwater biodiversity. But there's no such paper that exists on, or no such analysis that exists on estuarine fisheries in general. And then if you look at globally important biodiversity reports that have come out in recent years, the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the Living Planet report, which is published every 2 years by WWF. If you do a quick search on these reports with the word estuary or estuarine, there are hardly 1 or 2 instances where these words get a mention in these reports. The only exception is this recent Global Wetland Outlook, where there are some mention about estuaries and estuarine biodiversity and its conservation. So largely, estuarine ecosystems tend to get ignored on the global conservation agendas. So talking about Indian estuaries, we all know that India is very extremely rich in its estuarine resources and biodiversity. But the problem here is Indian estuaries continue to be poorly known. There are very few, if you look at the literature, there are very few synthesis or reviews focusing on estuarine biodiversity and conservation. So they have picked up 2 of the sort of more comprehensive reviews, one done by CIFRI and one done by the former director of NIO. But there is also a lack of nationwide estimates of the loss of estuarine habitats based on remote sensing or satellite imagery data. Although there are studies in different estuaries, if you look at a nationwide picture, there is no estimate of how much of estuaries we have lost. And there's very few time-scale analysis of changes in the environment or fishery in estuaries. And if you look at a case study of Vembanad Lake, so it's one of the most important Ramsar sites in India. So a paper published by the respected chair of this session in 1985 still remains one of the most comprehensive ichthyological inventory of that river system. And even if you look at fishery status, it's been relatively unknown since the 1990s when the chair and his team has worked extensively in the ecosystem, and there's also been some studies by CIFRI. But after that, there's been studies in some regions of the lake, but if you look at the entire lake, there's absolutely no picture of either biodiversity or fishery status. So this exemplifies the importance of research on estuaries. Now going into the 2 biodiversity targets that I'm going to talk about, again as I just briefly mentioned that estuarine ecosystems largely tend to get ignored in global targets. The same with Aichi biodiversity targets and the Sustainable Development Goals. Inland and estuarine ecosystems are either they are invisible or they are extremely poorly represented. Very few mentions about estuaries or estuarine ecosystems in both these 2 frameworks. So the Aichi biodiversity targets is nearing completion. The target is 2020, which is next year, and it's been implemented in different countries through the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plan, NBSAPs. And the 20 targets have been sort of clubbed together into 12 NBSAPs in India. And then you have 17 goals which the world countries are to attain by 2030 to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and harmony in the world. So the most important goal that relates to our conference here is goal 14, which is life below water, and it's several sub-goals, 14.1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But again, this is purely sort of focused on the marine realm, and there is extremely little focus on inland or estuarine. So they are, they are invisible, but they are certainly integral to the whole story. So I'll just quickly talk through some of these targets. One is target 1. I start with this because it is not only because it's serially the first target, but it's also the most important target for any sort of biodiversity conservation. Basically because public are not connected to estuarine ecosystems. Well, that's mostly for aquatic ecosystems in general. But there is a need for awareness and sort of educating the public about why we need to conserve biodiversity. I saw the first speaker today talking about ecotourism ventures in Maharashtra, where local communities are involved. So that's a good sort of initiative. There are also several initiatives where we can chip into and ask the governments to give a more focus on estuarine biodiversity. One is the Science Biodiversity Express. There's lots of citizen science, there's some good stories like citizen science initiatives in the Vembanad Lake, where an annual fish count is held with it's a participatory sort of approach. And then also we need to capitalize on the certain celebrations like World Fish Migration Day and World Wetlands Day, where we can involve local communities to ensure that they are connected to this biodiversity. The second target is target 5, which talks about reducing habitat loss in the world's ecosystems. Habitat loss is the single most important driver of biodiversity loss. We've lost 50% of estuarine habitats in the last 20 years. For example, Vembanad Lake has lost 40% of its area due to encroachment in the last 15 years. There's lots of sand and mineral mining going on. But then you also have some success stories, as told by the first speaker today, about increasing mangrove cover in some states, especially Maharashtra and Gujarat. Just a quick example of Vembanad Lake, where we have seen a 40% decline in area, 65% decline in depth, 78% decline in carrying capacity, and an increase in area under plantations from 27 to 40, area under settlements from 13 to 30. So this is the sort of habitat changes that are occurring in different estuarine ecosystems in the world. Although the target is to reduce habitat loss, but still we are far away from reaching that target. It is not that we don't have legislative and policy instruments in place. We have a whole range of legislative and policy instruments, but the problem is definitely enforcement, like any other policy or legal instrument in the country. So there are ways we can do it, but it is just the proactive will of our enforcement agencies there. And then those who are hooked onto social media are all about the 10-year challenge now. So this is a 10-year challenge in a much politicized story in Kerala now, Alappad, where mining has destroyed coastal villages. So this is a sort of satellite imagery of a 10-year change in that village due to habitat loss. Target 6 talks about sustainable management of aquatic living resources. But the problem with this is that estuaries have multiple ownership issues. Again, the focus is mostly on production, improving food security than conservation, which has always been the case. Then enforcement is extremely difficult because most of the fisheries is diffuse and it's widespread in nature. And then there's also issues with IUU type of fishing in these estuaries, which I'll just talk about in the next slide. So what we need is ecosystem-based approaches. There are some good things happening there. In Vembanad, we have lake protection forums by the local communities that help in such approaches. We don't really have recovery plans for species that are in decline. Semafara has come out with minimum legal size for a lot of marine fish and also mollusks that live in estuaries, but we need such plans for estuarine or brackish-water species. This is just an example of IUU fishing that takes place in the Vembanad Lake and Cochin backwaters, because for the last, since 1985, there has been no new licenses issued for either of these two nets that are in the picture, Chinese dip nets and stake nets. But still, there are lots of new nets that are coming up which catch a lot of juveniles and migratory species. So this is again an issue for achieving this target of sustainable management of aquatic resources. In Vembanad Lake, there are some studies that have shown that there are changes in trophic structure and fishing down the food web that is occurring. And the most classical example is the decline in pearl spot fishery from a few thousand tons to a few hundred tons over the last 60 years. But there are also some good stories like Hilsa conservation and management objectives in West Bengal, the short neck clam fisheries in Ashtamudi Lake, which has gone through the whole process of sustainability and certification with Marine Stewardship Council and WWF India. The next target is achieving sustainability in aquaculture. I think this has been talked about in the last 2 years, how shrimp culture has impacted different other land use change. So this figure is from a work done here at CIBA, where they've looked at what are the different land use changes or what land has been converted to shrimp farming in different states of India. So you can see it's different in different states, mud flats in some states it is agricultural land and so on. So what can we do about ensuring sustainability? There is a Coastal Aquaculture Act which may show ways to be responsible here. Dr. Sunil and Dr. Amir talked about ecosystem-based brackish water aquaculture, IMTAs, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. We also need to have a focus on native species because from the freshwater example, we have a lot of exotic species being farmed in the country. So it is better to try and popularize the native species in brackish water aquaculture. The target 8 talks about reduced pollution. There's a big flow of nitrogen and phosphorus from the land to the sea, and estuaries are caught in between. And it is said that this runoff has exceeded planetary boundaries, which is a threshold beyond which we can anticipate unacceptable consequences for humanity. And India is ranked 12th among 12 of 20 of the top countries responsible for coastal and marine pollution. And a whole range of pollutants have been recovered from estuarine ecosystems, right from microplastics, POPs, endocrine disrupting chemicals. So they're all there in the ecosystems now. So there are some good stories there. Citizen science-based water quality monitoring has been happening in Vembanad through a program known as Jaladarpanam, where local communities measure their water quality and report it to the Pollution Control Board to make sure that their water remains of good quality. And this is a very sort of a scary map that shows India right there with the highest risk of countries where pollution can impact rivers and estuaries for, towards 2050. So unless we do proactive approaches, it is extremely difficult to achieve the target of reducing coastal and marine pollution in the next 15 or 20 years. The most important issue again is invasive alien species. Estuaries are among the most invaded ecosystems in the world. Two main problems are ballast water, because most of the Indian ports are connected to estuaries. So these are the two major pathways, but extremely few studies that focus on invasive alien species and estuaries. As you can see, I've just seen only one presentation in the whole conference that focuses on this issue of alien species and estuarine biodiversity. There are several recent reports of exotic mussels being recorded from east and west coast estuaries. We have a huge problem since the last several decades of invasive weeds in estuaries. So what we need is really improved detection methods. So eDNA, environmental DNA, is one such method that can be widely used. Shall quickly go on to the other target, which is ecosystems vulnerable to climate change. So climate change is an issue, and with NICRA's projects, I think this might be taken care to a great extent. We have problems with protected areas. Only less than 10% of the inland areas, including estuaries, are protected. So we need more of either formal or informal protected areas in the country. There is a problem with threatened species being found in estuaries. So this is something again that the Wildlife Protection Act can take into account and do a good enforcement. Talking about ecosystem restoration, Chilika Lake is an extremely good example of ecosystem restoration, where they have said that every 1 rupee spent for restoration has now yielded 15 rupees back in terms of ecosystem services. Just to wrap up, so the Sustainable Development Goals, although 14 is the Sustainable Development Goal that is linked to life underwater, it's also intricately linked to all the other Sustainable Development Goals. So one is no poverty. So despite highly productive estuarine ecosystems in India, there is still a substantial amount of poverty that remains in the country. So this is something that we need to take care of. I'm just wrapping up in 1 minute. And zero hunger. So declining catches is again related to this goal 2 of reducing hunger. Since most of the big cities are built on estuaries, again this 14 is related to goal 11 of human settlements and how to improve sustainability in human settlements. Then the possibility of brackish water aquaculture contributing to sustainable economic growth is taken care of in goal 8. And finally climate action, goal 13, which is again linked to goal 14. So India is not doing very good in Sustainable Development Goal Index. So India is ranked 110th among the various countries in a study in 2016. And if you specifically look at Goal 14, so the red ones indicate that there are several challenges that still remain to achieve that goal. So India is not really doing well in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to finish, there is still time to save and sustainably manage our estuaries, but this is the time, and we should act now to make sure we sustain our estuaries and their biodiversity for the future. Thank you.